Welcome to Like Minded with Dr. Patrice. Each episode, we will sit down with different types of experts and unpack the intersection of mental health, pop culture, and our day-to-day lives. My name is Dr. Patrice Le Goy. I'm an international psychologist and a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm also a former entertainment executive. This episode, we will be discussing therapy stigma in communities of color and recognizing the impact of therapy deserts, areas where counseling services are inaccessible to the community and where they are not provided by therapists who represent the community where they serve. Today, I'm welcoming Sierra Smith. With more than 20 years of experience in both Los Angeles and Chicago's nonprofit sectors, Sierra Smith's career shifted from arts and culture and animal welfare to higher education and social services. At Open Paths Counseling Center here in Los Angeles, Sierra has tripled the annual budget, doubled the level of services, and implemented multiple programs and partnerships, making Open Paths one of the most sought-after clinical training agencies in Los Angeles. She's also guided the agency's vision of prioritizing historically marginalized communities in all aspects of the organization, including diversifying the board and staff to reflect the communities served by Open Paths. Sierra has been serving as the executive director of Open Paths Counseling Center since 2016, and also Open Paths is where I did all of my clinical training, so it's very near and dear to my heart. So welcome, Sierra. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm excited to be here with you, Dr. Patrice, and I love being able to call you Dr. Patrice.
Thank you. Can you talk to us a little bit about the stigma that you see in marginalized communities when it comes to seeking out mental health resources?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the stigma, it's not new, right? This is something that has gone back, historically, as long as we think about the stigma around mental health on the broader landscape before narrowing into communities of color, the associations with mental health, linking to the assumption that somebody must be, to use a pejorative, crazy, right? So it's really been, and you probably know this part better than I, what in the last century where we've seen mental health rise to the surface through more Eurocentric frameworks and become acceptable, particularly in more affluent communities through a psychoanalytic lens.
Yes.
And that's become much more socially acceptable, particularly in dominant culture. However, in historically marginalized communities, A, there's still not lack of access to psychoanalytic frameworks. B, the way that type of framework works often is not compatible with a lot of those communities. So we tend to live in the space where if you have challenges or struggles, you take it to church, you take it to your grandma, you take it to your aunties, you take it to your communities, and you push through, or you keep it to yourself.
That's right. A lot of suppression.
You keep it to yourself, and you're strong, and you don't show those types of vulnerabilities. And oftentimes we end up seeing those areas that I refer to as just the human condition of trauma, grief, stress, particularly chronic stress, particularly stress associated with navigating systems that can be very oppressive. The coping mechanisms that a lot of our communities use to navigate those, they become criminalized and pathologized instead of being associated with the very realistic underlying condition of stress and trauma. And it's placing oneself, particularly somebody who has grown up in a community of color where strength is so valued because it's been necessary for our survivals in these communities, that strength is valued to say, hey, I need help, right? And yet we all do. We all do.
And I think to your point, Sierra, when you're talking about the chronic stress of being in a marginalized community, the day-to-day kind of stressors, but also the bigger things, what's happening in the world, where there's racial violence, all of those things impact us. And so a lot of times you find people who really need this help feeling also like it's not available to them because they don't want. I've had clients tell me, please, I don't want my parents to know I'm here. That kind of adults. We're not talking about children. Adults who didn't feel comfortable sharing that. And I think that it's so important. You see kind of recent examples of of people of color talking about their mental health, like Taraji P. Henson, you know, out there
Yes.
saying like this is really important, and Selena Gomez and Demi Lovato, and people saying like I needed help.
Yeah.
So you might see me and look at me in this position and think, you know, I don't need that. My life's perfect. But, you know, it is a real thing that there are these stressors. So I find it really valuable that more people are speaking out about it and saying that, because you're right. It's go to church, keep it to yourself, figure it out, right? And just keep moving on. And then I think sometimes we wonder, like, why is there so much like disease, like heart disease and cancer in like these communities? It's trauma often, you know, like that's built up in the body, right? It's so damaging for us to keep this to ourselves. So, you know.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because one of my favorite celebrities
Mhm.
is Simone Biles.
Mhm. Yes,
And I
amazing.
look at what this powerful, amazing woman has done for mental health,
Yes.
and her stepping into it and owning it and saying, I don't care what you public
Yes.
think.
Yes.
I can take care of my mental health and still be the greatest of all time.
Absolutely.
Has been huge.
Absolutely.
Has been absolutely huge. The other part of it, though, that I think we have to recognize is that in a white dominant society, it can be very scary to show that vulnerability. So I think a big part of what we're trying to do, and I know what you're trying to do, is to change the narrative, where the expression of vulnerability is seen as strength, right? The expression of vulnerability means that you are owning your power because you are powerful enough
Yes.
to acknowledge that nobody makes it through their life without needing to care for their mental wellness.
Yes.
And, you know, that's just a fact of life. And one of the things that I think that we really have to look at is the underlying causes of, if we don't actually reach out for help, how does that manifest? That can manifest in substance use disorder as a way of coping with the trauma. That can manifest in insecure attachment in relationships, because perhaps, as we know, Black and brown communities are represented more in DCFS, and children removed from their homes more often, and that early trauma can often result in limited attachment, and that can cause dysfunctional attachment in relationships. We see it manifest, you know, to talk about one of the very stigmatized ways, in the ways in which trauma impacts intimate partner violence and abuse, right? So these are all things that have very systemic underpinnings. And by not caring for our mental health, and both the historical legacies of trauma that epigenetics have shown travel through, you know, the way the cells are structured intergenerationally, but also a lot of the daily trauma that comes from this space, including, like you referenced before, the watching of the murders of Black people on television, the over-incarceration of folks, recognizing that, you know, personally, I was pretty traumatized by watching children at the border being taken from their parents, and I couldn't help but think about how that's going to affect a generation of migrant children. These are the things that we can take on vicariously or secondarily that also impact us. And so it is so important to lift all that up. And I also think, conversely, one of the things that comes out of this is I find myself responding sometimes, and I find other folks that I'm in space with responding and going, can we just lift up the Black joy? Right?
Yes.
And whatever the Latine equivalent is for Latine joy or AAPI joy, like, can we just look at the joy? Can we lift up the other areas where we are thriving and where we have wonderful components? Because I think it also gets hard to hear about the ways in which oppression manifests. But I also recognize that I think that we have to have space for both.
Right.
And
What is that
all.
balance, you know, that we need to have? Because to ignore the reality is to our detriment, right?
Yeah.
But then that can't be that's not the only reality.
Exactly.
Right. There's also the other but that is joyful and celebratory, right? And you know,
Exactly.
focusing on that. I want to go back to something that you said about the like being the superhuman, the strength kind of thing, because I do think that there is a myth of what being a superwoman is, right? And we hear about that. Like, I'm strong, I can take anything. It's like, no, none of us can take anything, right? It shows up somewhere in our lives, you know, even if we don't realize, you know, and you mentioned whether it's, you know, it's violence in the home, you know, it's not being able to attach, you know, appropriately to other people, to build healthy relationships. It does show up other ways. And I really think that it's so important, what you mentioned about changing that narrative of what it means to be strong. It doesn't mean you can take anything that comes your way and you can do it on your own. It means that I'm strong enough to know that when I need help, when I need assistance, or when the person I'm seeking assistance from is not giving me what I need, right?
Yes.
So, if we're talking about going to family members or going to the church, I think when I try to explain to people, about the difference with therapy versus talking to a trusted friend, I believe in that too. I definitely believe talk to your friends, people who are supportive of you. But the difference is when you're talking to your family member, like if I'm going to my mom and I'm saying, I'm having this really tough time, she wants me to be okay. She is very invested in me being okay. So, she's going to try to get to that solution as fast as possible, or try to minimize it, maybe not by being hurtful, not trying to be hurtful, but just because she wants me to be fine, because it's really important to her. And it's not that therapists don't care whether or not you're fine. It's not that. It's that we are, I think, more willing to sit with you when you're not fine and give that the time and the space that it needs, right, for you to come to your conclusions. And it's really hard to do that with family members or close friends because you just want them to be good. You don't want them to be in this place of pain. And so that's kind of when I talk to people who say, oh, I feel bad going to a therapist, like, you can have both. I hope you have both. I hope you have both. I hope you have, supportive family and friends. And I hope you have someone who is just there to validate you, to sit with you and help you figure out what you need for yourself. That's not in a rush for you to get to the healing place,
The thing about it that I think is really important to look at is a therapist-client relationship is not a reciprocal relationship, nor should it be, right? And when you have family members and friends, even when it's a parent-child, the ways in which attachment works and family systems work means, and I should preface this, as you know, I'm not a therapist. So let me be clear.
But you're an amazing executive director.
I'm not a therapist, but I've been around them a lot. So I joke that sometimes, I could play a therapist on TV. So when I say therapy things, take it all with a grain of salt and check with your therapist. But what we recognize is that in a parent-child relationship, and I am a parent, and I am a child of parents, right? Is that that relationship is so primal that it's always going to be influenced by that relationship, even when the issue is not about that relationship. It's 100%. Always going to be an interwoven, interconnected relationship in a very different way, where it's not somebody that you can come to who, and I don't want to use the term that is an objective person, because I don't think, there's a whole back and forth about objectivity and therapy, and that's in a more dominant culture therapist lens, that and
blank wall.
We're moving away from that as a reality, and communities of color that have a more collectivist way of thinking about mental health. But at the same time, it's not a reciprocal relationship, so you don't have to have guilt about making it all about yourself in that space.
Yes.
And what an opportunity it is to really try to explore and grapple with some of those things that there may not be safety in exploring and grappling anywhere else in your life.
Yes.
Right? That's a huge gift. And one of the things I also want to say, because I think this comes up, and this comes up for me, is, I've had some pretty negative experiences in therapy in my life. And part of it is because I don't necessarily want to talk about all the things in that way. Yeah. And there's so many different ways to approach therapy that if for you going back and talking about your trauma isn't going to be what serves you at that point, you don't have to do it.
Yes.
Therapy can also be the place where you go in and you process your forward thinking about, okay, I'm sitting in this place of unease and something's not quite working right now. And I just want a place to really think about, what do I really want right now? How do I discern between what's my cycles that I have in my history and my patterns of behavior versus what's really going to move me to what this next space is that I want to get to, right? And so I think one of the things for a lot of us, particularly for people of color, that happens, I think there's a couple of things. One of them is that, we don't want to go back in and relive every single thing. And, you know, maybe if you go in because you're going in for something else, it may be that that's where you land at. So I'll give you an example. When my brother passed away of cancer, my husband was like, you're going to therapy. This is not an option. I need you to go to therapy. So this is before I worked at Open Paths, and I'd had some negative experiences, and I had some resistance to going, but I did because he was not wrong and that I should go. And what I found was that I really didn't talk about the loss of my brother. Now, maybe that was some avoidance or some other stuff, but what I spent a lot of time talking about was the challenges that I was having at work, particularly, well, I was having some challenges at work, navigating some of the oppressive systems at work. And because that was my daily life in that moment, like that's what was so front and center. And that therapeutic experience helped me really figure out with clarity, what do I want now?
Well, and Sarah, I think that's part of like culturally affirming therapy. It's not just that you're sitting across from someone who may have some similarities to you or may come from the same background as you, but also like centering the client as the expert in their lives. What do they need, right?
Yes.
And versus my agenda. Well, you know, first I need to talk about your relationship with your mom, and we do need to talk about it, but we'll get to it, right? Like what is the need that you have in front of you? And I think that that's so important. Like when people do have bad experiences in therapy, recognizing that might not have been the right therapist for you, or maybe, you know, it wasn't the right timing. There's a lot of things, but keep looking until you find someone. You find someone that you connect with, that you can build rapport with, and that lets you, you know, to a certain extent, not, we can't avoid all day, but lets you kind of bring what you need to the table, you know, and talk about that. And I think that's all part of being like affirming to the clients that we see, you know, and hopefully helping to reduce that stigma, you know, that we're talking about. Yeah.
That's huge. And it's interesting because I also think a lot of it is fear of, are you going to find somebody who's going to understand you?
Yes.
You know, are you going to find somebody who's not going to pathologize you? Are you going to find somebody who's going to be able to hold all the different parts of you?
Yes.
And that's really hard. And, you know, I had a colleague whom you know, who was a very long-time therapist, who was a white therapist, who shared about one of her experiences with a Black client, a Black man who went to therapy with her. And this always stood out for me about what does it mean to be understood. And this therapist, who was quite a good therapist in many ways, had made one critical error with this man who came to therapy with her. This therapist came through a lens of any type of physical punishment to a child is abuse.
Got it.
And whether or not that's the case is not what I'm going to bring into the space here, because there's a vast array of opinions around that. And for the record, I personally do not spank my kids, but I do not pass judgment in how other people choose to parent without understanding and knowing their legacy and their history and what happens, and the fact that all of us parents are doing the best we can. But this therapist was very keen on recognizing any type of physical punishment as abuse. And so when this Black man came to her for therapy, he would talk about his relationship with his mother, who he loved very much, but his relationship did involve spanking. And because the relationship involved spanking, she kept trying to bring him around to acknowledging that his mother was abusive. And at one point in the therapy, he finally said, you know what? You're right. My mother was abusive. And he left and he never came back.
Yes.
And I use that as a deep example because if you as a white therapist are going to push a Black client to understand a history of abuse that comes with it, you have to so deeply understand the legacy of slavery and racism and trauma. And you have to understand how that permeates the culture and community, because the reality is that Black parents for hundreds of years have had to hold a space of what does it mean to love your child so fiercely that you recognize that if they make one slight error, they can be murdered?
It could be their life, right? And you don't have any other choice but to
Exactly.
make sure that there's no misstep, right?
Exactly.
I don't know. Dr. Joy DeGruy, this amazing author of Intergenerational Slave Trauma,
Yes.
she uses an example in the beginning of her book to discuss this, where she talks about being in a bank, and she's in the bank. She sees two little black kids, two little white kids, both with their moms, and she sees the white kids they're not misbehaving. They're going up, to the teller, like when you could go get the lollipops. I don't know if they still do that. I don't go in banks anymore. But and you could just get the lollipop. They were just being kids, right?
Yeah.
And the two little black kids, she just noticed that they were sticking really close to their mom. Their mom's like, don't touch anything. No, don't get that. Don't go have that. And you could see the kids, she described it, the kids looking at the other children, like with kind of longing and like, why don't I get to be a kid, get that lollipop? But it is so ingrained that you are well behaved. You do not step out of line, right? Because for generations, that has been your life, right? If anything could be misconstrued. And I just always think of that because obviously, I have a young son. And I think of like, I want him to feel like he belongs in this world, but I have to like lead by example, right? Knowing what we know and also not wanting to pass that down to him. And I think that that's one of the things, like when we talk about therapy in this way, most people can have examples from their own lives and they can say, oh, okay, well, I've never thought of that of being like, maybe from that history of trauma. Maybe like therapy could be good for me as well, right? You can see that show up. I think it's just being able to talk about it in that way. And I mean, I used to lead a parenting group and spanking would come up all the time. I mean, I got spanked. I choose not to spank, but I know that there's no benefit in shaming someone who's done it because, as you say, they'll just say, okay, I'll never see you again. And now, you've lost an opportunity to connect with someone, to maybe show them there's different ways of parenting, right? Because, you're bent on being judgmental about it and not understanding the legacy. I can easily say, I got spanked. I don't think my parents were abusive, but I got spanked.
And I was spanked too.
Yeah.
And I absolutely don't consider myself a child of abuse either.
And I'm just not going to because
and
now I have different
choose
tools.
Not to
right?
as well.
Yes.
And that's exactly it also. It's like, what are we coming to this with? You and I both have the tremendous privilege of education.
Absolutely. It's such a privilege, yes.
And we have financial privilege. And that carries a lot with it in that we have options in how we can navigate the world and the resources we can use also for the protection of our children in a different way.
Absolutely.
And mind you, they're still going to have things that, we can't protect, we can't protect them from the color of their skin. And, we can't protect them in some of those ways, but there are ways with that. And it's an interesting thing in how we manifest this, because one of the other things that from the post-traumatic slave syndrome, that I always remember, and I think this is something that culturally we've actually done a very good job of turning the tide with, was the history of what it meant to speak poorly about your child. Do you remember the story?
Yes.
About why the girls were insulted so much, and not necessarily insulted directly, but insulted around other people because of the liberties that historically white men could take with black girls. And by girls, I'm talking about children.
Yes.
That you didn't want your black female child to be noticed or appreciated. You didn't want them to be thought of as being pretty because it meant that they were more likely to be raped. They were more likely to be victimized. So if somebody notices, oh, look at how nicely so-and-so is growing up. Oh, but she's slow.
Exactly.
Oh, but she's stupid. Oh, but whatever, as a form of protection.
Measure. Yes, absolutely.
And of course, that also does have something that's going to be a part of the psyche of the child who's hearing that, who may not understand that that's a protective component.
Who definitely doesn't understand.
My mother is saying I'm slow or stupid because she doesn't want me to be raped, not necessarily because she doesn't feel like that. And what does that look like? And these are the contexts that we have to have such an acute awareness about when we're stepping in a space of being mental health providers for communities of color. And I can speak more about this with the Black community because I have more familiarity in that space. But I also know enough to know that this carries over into many different global majority
Absolutely.
cultures.
I mean, I would say that, I have had several clients from different backgrounds tell me that they didn't want anyone in their family to know that they were seeking out therapy.
Yeah.
I mean, it runs deep, because, whether you are Black American family, an immigrant family, there needs to be like a model of strength that you put forward, because you're going to face a lot of obstacles, right? And to let any of those in, I think sometimes people are afraid that they'll crack completely, right? And so, you build up a wall to say, I'm strong, I can handle anything that comes my way. And the idea of acknowledging the vulnerability can be very scary for some people. Like, how do you put yourself back together once you acknowledge all of like the hurt and the pain and the trauma and the stressors that you deal with day to day?
I think it's important too to recognize, as we just are leaving Suicide Awareness Month, that suicides among Black folks are on the rise, particularly boys and men and young boys and men. Aware, one of the times when we had a very acutely suicidal client at Open Paths Counseling Center, it was a Asian young man who had an older brother die by suicide. And the older brother's suicide was not spoken about in the family after that. And it was, obviously incredibly traumatic, as any death by suicide is. And so the younger brother, who was grappling with the older brother's death by suicide, was really struggling and had become suicidal himself. And he felt very uncomfortable with the notion of getting therapy. He was in his early to mid 20s. So he reached out, and luckily he had a very strong therapeutic alliance with his therapist, who was also somebody who who did an excellent job of working with him and had referred him multiple times to seek out psychiatric support as well for his depression and suicidality. But he wasn't comfortable doing that because that meant it would have been on the insurance.
Yes.
And
Which is
his
another
parents would
barrier
have
for a
seen
lot
it.
of people, yes.
And so it got to the point where he had planned out his suicide so much so that he had rented a hotel room because he didn't want his parents to find him. And luckily, he had reached out to his therapist on the day he was planning to die by suicide that evening in the hotel, because, the way he framed it was he wanted to say goodbye and to thank her. We see that as a reaching out for help. And she said, please come to the office and let's talk about this. And he came, and it was not quite as easy as please just come to the office.
Yes,
there was some work that happened with all that about how we're going to go about creating safety for this. But once he was there in with her, we called emergency services, and we got him the appropriate care, which included short-term hospitalization at that time. But he didn't die by suicide. He did continue to work with that therapist for a number of months afterwards. And his parents will never know how close they got to losing a second son.
Wow.
I mean, he may tell them at some point, but it's one of those things where, as a parent, you recognize that you may not always know what's going on, and the cultural shame of needing to reach out for therapy almost cost them a second son.
Well, and just, by the point that it was never discussed, he knew that his parents were not able to tolerate this conversation with him. So, rather than hurt his parents again by telling them he was really struggling, he, was willing to just go at it alone. So I do think, going back to that conversation about stigma and about, having access to resources to people who can understand why he can't talk to his parents, understand that kind of thing without him needing to explain himself. And, well, this in my community, this is why it's like this. And, that kind of thing, right? There's a pressure to be like this or to be like that. It's just, it provides clients. It's already really difficult to decide to go to therapy. And it just removes one of the barriers. But, in addition to the stigma and, access to maybe therapists who come from the community where you come from, like, what are some other barriers that you see? I know we could talk about this all day.
Oh, the barriers to therapy. My favorite subject. So I will tell you the biggest barriers that I see. The number one barrier is money.
Yes.
Money is by far the biggest barrier. And we're in a very critical time period right now for mental health because we have trends that are very concerning that are happening. The trends that are happening at this point in time is that because the need for mental health care and psychotherapy has become so exacerbated because of the trauma of the pandemic, and there's so many other things. It's not just the pandemic. And quite frankly, I think we've always had this need. We've just never recognized it. So I don't necessarily think that the mental health pandemic, as they talk about it, is new. I think it's just our speaking about it is new. Right. But that being said, now that we do have this much broader awareness, now that the Surgeon General has put out this report, now that we know the kids are not okay, and that's a whole other ballgame because this is the first time where I will say we've had the level of children struggling. That is different. Adults, but the level of children struggling is at a ridiculously disproportional rate. With all of this, people who can afford to pay out of pocket are. And what does it mean to pay out of pocket? It means to pay, on average, $150 to $300 a week. So you're talking about adding about $1,000 to $1,500 bill that maybe you weren't expecting because you've now discovered that your child is in crisis or you're in crisis or your partner's in crisis, out of pocket, because the reimbursement rates through insurance are so low.
Yeah, many therapists don't take insurance because it is
so low. And on top of that, just becoming enrolled as a provider in insurance agencies has become increasingly difficult. Just becoming enrolled as a provider in Medicaid nationally and Medi-Cal for us in California. As a nonprofit community counseling center, we have been working to become Medi-Cal providers for 8 months now. And the barriers that have been put up are kind of mind-blowing to me when I've got licensed and registered therapists who are registered and licensed through the California Board of Behavioral Sciences saying that these are qualified therapists, and yet the state doesn't recognize them because our structure is a 501c3 nonprofit community counseling center rather than a for-profit corporation that is intended for shareholder value.
Which is so ironic. And I think that, lesser clients or potential clients don't recognize. They think, okay, well, even if you have insurance, if you're lucky enough to have insurance, then you're probably thinking, okay, now I can find a therapist. And then that's overwhelming as well when you start reaching out to therapists and see like, oh, no one takes my insurance. Now what? I can't afford to pay out of pocket, to your point about, the $150 to $300 an hour, especially like in a city like Los Angeles, that is the going rate for therapy. And so money is a barrier. Once you make the decision to seek out therapy, you still have to overcome all of these hurdles, such as money, people not taking your insurance, right? What else do you see?
Well, and I want to say before I leave the insurance thing, and then I will move on to the other areas, is that one of the things that I think is a little bit disingenuous that I do see a lot of therapists doing that really challenges me is they list on the common sites that they take all these different insurances. And then when you reach out to them, they say, oh, I don't actually take these insurances, but I will give you a super bill.
That's right.
And you can get reimbursed, which assumes that the client who is reaching out has the discretionary income
to pay up front.
And then wait the 6 to 8 plus weeks to get reimbursed, assuming the therapist puts everything correct or that they do everything correct and that it actually does get reimbursed.
That's right.
And I would really like to ask the therapists of the world, I'm asking you, if you don't take insurance, just put that you don't take insurance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't put that you do and give that false hope. And even worse, don't put that you take insurance and then not return people's phone
Yeah,
calls.
yeah.
Because I hear story after
So
story
many
after
stories,
story of
yes.
people going, I made all these calls. And quite frankly, I have done it. I have done it looking for mental health providers from
Yes.
families and friends that I care about. And I will make a slew of calls
And not get called back.
and
Yeah.
not get a return
Yeah.
call.
Yeah.
So
It's such a good point, Sierra. I think that that's an oversight, right, as well, when you're thinking, okay, well, I can give you a super bill and you can get reimbursed for it, but I have to have the money first to do that, you know.
Yes.
And I think that even recognizing that, that maybe a lot of therapists don't think about, but for clients, if you're struggling, you're in a place of crisis, and it's someone's not getting back to you, or they actually don't take your insurance, and people give up. Like, you really
Yes.
imagine how many people tried to
Yep.
seek out therapy and could not, because it just, again, was not accessible to them. you
And
know?
quite frankly, for most people of color, in my experience, they wait.
Mm,
They wait to seek a therapist until the crisis is so acute
yes.
and the pain is so much that they feel like there isn't another alternative.
Mm,
They're not, and I hope this is changing, and I hope I'm wrong about this, but most folks we see coming to us, they're not coming going, you know what? I just want to I'm doing pretty good. I just want to make sure that I stay pretty good, and I want to build this therapeutic relationship so that in the future, when something
Yeah.
happens, we have this relationship and you'll be ready to help me through whatever happens, if
Yes.
it's the loss of a loved one or whatever it is. I wish people would
Yes.
come to us
Not in
proactively.
community mental health. We hardly ever see. I don't know if I've ever heard someone say, like, I'm doing well. I'm like, oh, you are? Okay, great.
Yeah, I just need a place to process the daily occurrences.
Yes.
We don't have that. They
Yes.
come because the pain is acute and they need help now.
Yes,
So the financial is big.
absolutely.
And quite frankly, it takes a while to get placed in community mental health. In our short times, you're going to get placed in 2 to 3 weeks. In our long times, it might be 2 to 3 months,
Yes.
sometimes a little bit longer. So that's the money, and the money is huge. So
Yeah,
I don't
it
want to
is.
discount that.
Absolutely.
The next thing that I think comes up is culture.
Mm.
And I want to be very clear about this. It's a very interesting space to talk about culture because culture shows up in so many different ways. But when I'm talking about culture in these spaces, I'm talking about what I refer to as non-optional identities, right? Your race, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, your gender, your socioeconomics, which, they may fluctuate over time, but normally when you're in whatever socioeconomic situation you're in, it's not that you're choosing it, it's that those are your circumstances at that time, right? And it's not something you can wake up tomorrow and just change.
Absolutely.
So these are things that I consider non-optional identities, right? One of the biggest ways that I think we reduce the stigma to mental health is by really putting the message out to, I try to target young people of color to consider this as not just a viable career opportunity, but an incredible career opportunity. Because when you sit across the room from a therapist who has some sort of shared experience of what it means to live in the world with you, it can go so far in reducing stigma.
Yes.
Right?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to ask you, what you at Open Paths are doing to reduce that stigma. So you're saying that one of the things that you're doing is trying to introduce this as a career, as an incredible career opportunity, for people to have, for young people to have, because to your point, we have a shifting narrative, but it's shifting slowly, right? And when you can sit with someone who you don't have to explain everything to, or you see young people who are much more accepting of, like, yes, of course, like, we all need help. We're all experiencing trauma and stressors. I do think that does something for the person that is sitting in the room with them, and then everyone that person interacts with. So now, because, my cousin went to therapy and has some place to process all of the things, that is not in a shaming or blaming kind of environment, maybe now she can be a little bit more patient with her kids, and maybe they see, like, something different modeled for them, right? Because all of it has to come from, like, let's explore how we got here without saying this is so-and-so's fault. This is something insurmountable, right? That we can't ever get over, because that's not helpful either, right? You can acknowledge the realities and also acknowledge that there are different ways of doing things than maybe the things that haven't been working for you in the past. So I think that it's such an important, point to talk about bringing this as a community option. I'll tell you something really funny, Sarah. When I first changed careers and decided to go become a therapist, and I got my master's in marriage and family therapy, I remember talking to my parents about it, and they said, "Why would you leave? Like, you have a good job, it pays well. Why would you leave that? Who leaves a good job to go back to school and like be a student in your 30s?" And my mom's, I remember her saying, like, you just want to go and listen to people's problems all day?" And I was like, "Oh, that's not really what therapy is." But there is, people think that either you're just listening to people's problems, or that you're giving advice. And I think there's room for helping people problem solve, but I'm not telling you what to do. And I think one of the reasons I think of it that way is because if someone comes into therapy, they're sharing like a fraction of their lives with me. You're telling me whatever you want me to know. I'm not going to go and Google you. I'm not going to go and find out all these other things. So I only know what you're telling me. And you might tell me, and clients do, tell you months later, "Oh, did I ever tell you about this thing?" Or, this other brother that I have. Like, you didn't tell me that. You know that you've been keeping that to yourself. Like, we haven't discussed this. But it's your not priority. What's the Bobby Brown song? It's your prerogative.
Your prerogative.
to do that if you want to. And so I think that, there is that balance of not giving advice because I don't know everything about you. You do, though. And you know what's best for you. And I can help you work through that. So I think that there's some like also misunderstandings of what therapy is.
Yeah,
and
I'm that client that you described who's like, "Oh, yeah, I'm coming to you for this, but once I trust you after 4 months, I'll tell you about this thing that happened a year ago." But I'll tell you something interesting that really gave me an epiphany was, we have a joke, which is not a great joke, about Black men who are becoming therapists, that they're unicorns because there's not many of them, and we all want them.
Yes.
We all want them. If you are a Black man thinking about having a career in mental health, do it. You will have so much career security, and you can have such a thriving career. But when I used to work for the African American Board Leadership Institute, and my job was to go out and recruit African American professionals to train and serve on governing boards. And so I would go to all these different professional associations, and in looking at the landscape, so this is a Sierra experience, right? This may not be broad, but here's a little bit of what I saw in the landscape of career paths that I saw Black men take on a broad lens. When I looked at who had terminal degrees, there were so many EDDs, doctorates in education, and there were so many MBAs, financial professionals, and I was like, interesting. Like, and in thinking about that after I got to Open Paths, when it's like there were so few Black men looking at careers in mental health. And so whenever we saw folks doing it, we always tried to encourage and lift up, and we all fought for them to try to come to our counseling centers and such. And I still do. And, I recognized I would go to these associations and I'd have meetings and I'd have these conversations and I'd talk to them and I'd be like, "You want to be a therapist. You got the education doctorate." Because in a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, in my experience of Black cultural ways in which we lift up pathways to careers that are really important career paths, we look at money and go get that money, get your MBA, get your finance, do that. So you see that as being a strong career path, and you look at the importance of education. And education is such a fundamental part of Black culture, in my experience, that doctorate in education becomes so critical. And so these two pathways, I see a lot of representation in. And the MBA folks, like they tend to know what they want. They're good. But the EDD folks, so many of them that I would talk to, oftentimes are like, "Well, I just want to mentor the next generation. I just want to talk to them. I just want to be there for them." And I'm like, they're like, "I don't necessarily want to be in the classroom." You have some who really do. They're teachers at heart, right? And they're educators. But a lot of them are therapists at heart. But they're not therapists in name, and they're not actually therapists in training. But they're therapists at heart because they want to be the ones to be there and listen and guide and help shape. And therapists don't guide and shape and give advice. I know this. I'm aware of this. But they do create space
Yes.
for people to become all they can be, and they provide frameworks and perspectives and help and they use inquiry in ways that allow their clients to expand beyond what they may have come up with on their own, right? And that type of support, I'm like, and they also want to help heal trauma,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And I'm like, you should have been a psychologist.
Well, I wonder how many people don't consider that as a career path because maybe some bad experiences, or even if it was just people talking in your family, like saying, "Oh, that person's crazy,"
Yeah.
they should go talk to someone, and that's the only person you should go talk to someone is someone who's not well,
Exactly.
right? And so
Exactly.
it's hard to look at that as a potential career opportunity when you're like, you don't want to be associated with that. You've only heard it in a negative connotation. So yes, so I mean, I think money definitely, being one of the barriers. Having the ability to have people, like you said, there's some people who are unicorns. And I will say, for me, leaving corporate America and becoming a therapist, I was like, oh, this is wonderful. I mean, it has its downside because there also probably is like a connotation to that of like the all wise, Black woman, right? But, maybe if I was a little bit older too, like that would be the thing. But everyone wanted to come see me. And it was such a shift from corporate America where you feel like, I'll speak for myself, you almost constantly have to prove, that you deserve to be there versus people like, oh, can't get enough of like, coming to Black therapists. And I don't know. I think that might be its own kind of, cultural issue, but it was a very dramatic shift that I noticed. So, I mean, I definitely do encourage people. And actually, I've had several friends who've left corporate America and become therapists and like are in training for therapists because, I think that people have seen how much joy and like what an honor it is to sit with someone, when they're going through like their toughest times, but also through their brightest times because they share those as well, and you can celebrate together. And so I think that hopefully people do look at this as a path because it's for you, it's for your community, they need to see you there as well. And I think that helps to reduce the barriers. And before we go, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the therapy deserts because it kind of really all comes together, right?
Yeah.
Because, well, talk about therapy deserts, Sierra, because it's something I know that's really important to you.
It is. And I live in one, and that's part of why it's important. And, there's a joke in Los Angeles that you can't throw a rock in West LA or Eagle Rock or some of the more affluent communities without hitting a therapist. There's so many therapists in certain neighborhoods in Los Angeles, and they tend to be the predominantly more affluent and the predominantly white neighborhoods where it's just a given that there's a lot of therapists and therapy is accessible, right? And then you get to historically under-resourced, redlined, and underinvested communities, which, because it's Los Angeles, are primarily communities of color. In other parts of the country, they may not be communities of colors. But in LA, it is very much, it was historically Black communities, and now they're much more Latinx communities with Black pockets within it. And certainly we have some specifically Asian represented communities in there in Koreatown and other parts of Los Angeles. And in these areas, the mental health services that you traditionally see that are available are the mental health services that are provided through the county and that are intended for the part of our population that really struggles with moderate to severe mental health issues that require psychiatric intervention in addition to psychotherapy. And that, when you and I have been talking for this conversation, we've primarily been talking about people who are navigating mild to moderate health concerns, which I joke about being concerns of being alive. Grief, trauma, stress, anxiety, depression. If you live to adulthood and middle age, you're going to experience some of those at some point. It's just going to happen to all of us, right? Nobody lives to a ripe old age and doesn't lose loved ones. So we're all going to experience that. But what we're not all going to experience is that severe mental health concern that is going to be those diagnoses that have a much more severe impact on somebody's life and their ability to move through their day in a way that allows them to operate independently, right? And so if you live in a neighborhood like mine and you are seeking out mental health and you're reaching out to a place where you want to go to it, for the most part, those are the only places it's available. And so,
and then once you get there, it's also very expensive.
yeah, well, once you get there, so it may not be expensive necessarily because a lot of these are government-funded organizations, right? What we're talking about are government-funded organizations, but you're going to be in that waiting room for a while with folks who are severe. I mean, that was one of the big challenges we had when we had to refer out because somebody was above our scope of care that we could provide, is we would have to prepare them that you might be in a waiting room with people who are in severe mental health crisis for a period of time, and they may be unmedicated, and you need to just be aware that you are going to be seen and you are going to get help, but it can be a little bit scary being in that space. And that is who our county and our government-funded agencies in Los Angeles County, that's a population they are designed to support. So if you don't fall into that space, you absolutely can get seen if you are suicidal, if you have something that is severe and chronic and needs to be addressed right away. They're going to stabilize you. They're going to stabilize you and support you in that moment, but they're not there for long-term care. That's not the population that they provide long-term care for. They provide long-term care for chronic, severe mental illness, not for the person who's in crisis, stabilized, and then you're off on your own again. And so whatever it was that led you to that can come back. And you don't necessarily have that continuity of care. And they're often referred, okay, so you're stabilized now. You're no longer actively suicidal. Let's try to connect you with a provider. Here's a list. Good luck. Go find it.
Well, and I think, that kind of just like drives home the idea of when you think of someone needing help, you see the more extreme examples. And so you think, well, that's not me.
Exactly.
So I guess I don't need it. I guess I'll just keep dealing with what I'm dealing with and keep moving along, right? And so when I think in other communities, people talk about it, right? They say, oh, well, yeah, I'm going to my therapist. And it's just a given. So-and-so's been in therapy forever. Oh, you should go talk to a therapist. And there's not that layer of shame and stigma necessarily. I'm not saying all communities, but often it's just more of a given, and where I see people saying, I don't want anyone to know that I'm coming to talk to you is primarily in communities of color.
Absolutely.
That's where there is an underlying, even if we don't know why, we don't know where it came from, like we've discussed, people have it. They know that doesn't feel good. Like that's not a thing you want people to know about you.
Exactly. And on top of that, so we have this assumption now that because telehealth is an option, well, we've magically solved the geography thing,
right.
But we haven't.
No.
Because one of the things that we found during the shutdown was that not everybody has access to telehealth.
Yeah, that's right.
And some of the folks who were the most impacted by the pandemic did not have access. Having telehealth means you have to have a stable internet connection.
Yes. You need privacy.
You need privacy. Privacy was a big one. We had so many families where there were so many family members in such a small space. You have 5 or 6 family members living in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, and they don't have the privacy. Right? They don't have the access. They don't have the internet security, right? They don't have you can do it on your phone, but it's not easy to do therapy on your phone. It's just not. Yeah. So one of the ways that we try to mitigate that is we partner with a lot of community-based organizations, and we co-locate our therapists at those community-based organizations in the communities that are therapy deserts. So then that way, when clients might be there getting their We partner with a number of social service agencies where clients will go to pick up their weekly food box from the food pantry, and they can do therapy while they're there. Clients who are getting connected to social services can do therapy while they're there. And so, some of these places have been amazing and have transformed these magnificent therapy rooms. But quite frankly, if you give me an oversized broom closet,
totally, we can do it.
I can turn that.
I've been an oversized broom closet.
I can have a scarf and a throw pillow and a little lamp and a sound machine, and I will throw that into a therapy room so fast. I can take an auditorium and make a little corner as long as nobody else is in the auditorium, which we've done at schools when we co-locate at schools. But you have to make it available for people who need it in person as well as telehealth. Yes. And the other part of it is folks, telehealth and that being the primary mode of communication is native to younger generations. It is not native to my generation. It is not a comfortable space for me to do it. And I don't want to do telehealth. And so depending on who you are, telehealth has its limitations. Telehealth is not as effective for couples as it is for individuals.
Yes.
It's just not. Telehealth is not effective for elementary school-age children and younger. Play therapy. It has to be some form of engaging with children in a way where there is another medium. Because if you ask a child to sit there and talk to you,
Oh, yes.
even for 30 minutes, there has to be an activity that you're doing together.
Absolutely. I remember when COVID first happened, we thought it would just be a couple weeks, and I was seeing clients in telehealth, and they're like, "Oh, let me show you my room," and I'm sitting there on the computer. They've left the room, and they're like, they're in another room, like not because it's not. They're not thinking, "Oh, I need to take this computer to my room and show my counselor my room." I'm sitting like, "Oh, come back," I can't see you. It just wasn't like it wasn't. And they didn't have privacy a lot of times too, which is so important, right? And so, being able to share things, being able to have those difficult conversations relies on a lot of things, and especially for kids because they need a lot to feel safe already.
Yeah.
And then we took away one of their main things, which is like just it being one-on-one, right? Us being able to play a game and not having the pressure of you having to talk to me, for 50 minutes, right? I think that telehealth is amazing, and it still works really well for some people. And it's not the only solution. Like going out and being in the community, and like the way that Open Paths has, the way all these programs that you've built there is so valuable. And in addition to addressing the therapy deserts, it also helps reduce the stigma, right? Because here I am in the community, you see me all the time, you know me, right? And I think that all of that stuff builds together to kind of address both of those issues.
Can I give you an interesting antidote?
Yes, please.
So at the center, and it's a pretty nice little place. Our building it's not the greatest building. Our elevator gives me a heart attack every once in a while. But when you get inside of our suite, it's really important that it feel comfortable and safe. And, our former clinical director, Dr. Hedayat, once said when we were redesigning our last center, she's like, everyone is entitled to beauty. Yes. And I was like, yes, everyone is entitled to beauty, right? And it can be the simple things. But during the shutdown, we partnered with USC's theater design students to create these, what we call peace pods. And they're these, individual environments that are designed to reduce the nervous system, and just by the physical design of the environment, calm people's central nervous system and make them feel more comfortable. And one of the pods is sort of this oval that encompasses both the therapist and the client in this warm light. That's this warm, glowing light. And the client can hold a little remote control, and they can make the light brighter if they want, which if you have seasonal affectiveness disorder, which I struggle with when I used to live in Chicago, I want one of those for my bedroom personally. But also you can dim the light to make it quite dim, because one of the things that can happen is the intensity of the eye-to-eye contact can be really hard. And so the therapists will often anecdotally say that when the clients want to share something that's more vulnerable, because they have that little remote in their hand, they'll dim the lights. Yes. And it becomes a safer place to do it. And telehealth, if you're in a room with the client, you don't necessarily have to maintain eye contact in the same way. But there's something about that screen in front of you.
That's right. It's such a good point.
The screen unconsciously tells you should be maintaining eye contact. And ethically, you really should not turn off your screen. Yeah. Screens should not be off during therapy.
That's right.
So there's this added pressure. So there's just ways in which telehealth can be amazing, and it can be amazing access, particularly for people who might have challenges getting to a physical location. But if we can, in addition to the access that telehealth provides, also work to make sure that we are creating physical access, that can be such a tremendous support for folks.
Absolutely. I think that's such a good point. And, it also, what you're describing with the peace pods, it also gives people more control over what's happening, right?
Yeah.
If you're feeling out of control in so many areas of your life, just having that ability, I need the lights a little bit dimmer right now. I'm going to tell you something, but maybe I don't want you, staring at me so intently while I tell you. Even that is another way of because part of what we're doing is seeking to empower our clients, so that they can make the best decisions for their lives. And that even I'm going to do what I need right now. That's an expression, that like the therapy is working and is in a good place because, they're putting their needs and they're able to articulate what their needs are and act on them. I think that's so important. We're out of time, but this has been such a great conversation, Sierra. If people want to know what's happening with Open Paths, what you're working on, how can they find out more?
The best way to find out is to go to our website, www.openpaths, OPENPATHS. Don't forget that S because paths is plural, .org. And they can sign up for our newsletter about partway through there, our e-newsletter that goes out. They can learn more about our programs and services. And if they are in Los Angeles County or know someone who's in Los Angeles County who is struggling and who would benefit from therapy and can't afford it in other places because we center people who don't have access to it in other ways, absolutely have them reach out to us, and we will do our very best to make sure that they are well provided for with their mental health needs.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much,
Oh,
Sarah.
this was a pleasure. It's an honor to be with you, Dr. Patrice.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. So that's the end of our discussion. If you want to follow me, I can be reached on Instagram at therapy_with_Dr_Patrice or at drpatricelegoy.com. Thank you.